like I said when we started, last week was a little awkward. I couldn't talk. So, still getting there. Some sort of virus. I think I ended up with laryngitis and been trying to get my vocal cords back working. And we're getting there. Hopefully I can make it through this one. But last week it was great to hear this reminder, even like I said, when we started this, I don't want it to just necessarily be just my voice. So it was good to hear just even another voice just talking about just the importance of the church as Jesus' family and just understanding what the family is all about, how we come here together. And we come here together as different people that may not have known each other for any other reason at different, for all of our lives. But now we've come together around the common point of Jesus Christ. And Jesus like, I'm making you guys a family. It's like for no other reason but me and my purposes, I'm making you a family. And that should radically change our worldview. It should change our outlook on everything. We come from these biological families, and yes, our family is important. But there's something so much bigger happening with this universal family of Jesus that he is building throughout the whole world and throughout all the time. It's a spiritual family being built. I don't believe there's literally any way to overstate the importance and the gravity of what it means to be part of Jesus' family. I don't think I could use any sort of descriptive terms or anything that would overstate how important and how amazing it is to be part of Jesus' family. What it means to be God's people, what it means to be saved, what it means for our future, for our present. I believe it completely redefines every aspect of life. Even before we get into our main passage, I wanted to look at, just even to hammer this home all the more, because I think it even plays into where we're going to be at. There's a passage in 1 Peter, and if you want to turn there, if that's cool, give me in 1 Peter chapter 1, or I can read it. But it just brings this picture together and kind of even sets the stage a little bit for where we're going this morning. 1 Peter 1. Like I said, we will be back in Matthew in a moment, but 1 Peter 1, we're going to read just verses 9 and 10. There's a lot of good stuff in here, but just for the moment, just to get this point, we'll just look at verses 9 and 10. Actually, I think I'm in the wrong chapter. It's 1 Peter 2, verses 9 and 10. I wrote that down wrong. Now, 1 Peter 2, verses 9 and 10. So Peter writes, and he's talking to the church and even talking through some issues and stuff that are going on. But he brings to them an important just reminder, an important truth. Starting in verse 9, he says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people," God's own special people, "that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." It says, you were not even once a people. It says, who are not even a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy at all, but have now obtained mercy. There's this picture of just God working through all of history and working through all of the happenings of the world. And he's like, all of you people, it's like you may have belonged to countries and belonged to biological families. It's like, but you weren't a people gathered for any reason. But he said through all of God's workings and through what Christ has done, he has now gathered his people together. And that's us. That's us as God's people. And it's incredible, to really understand the importance of that. Christ changes everything. And God calls us his own special people. That we're called out of darkness into his marvelous light. So we move from death to life, from dark to light, from nothing to having purpose as God's people. Everything changes in Jesus. But why did he do that? Why did God take us who were not a people and create his own special people? I think Jesus in our passage this morning is going to answer some of those questions. So if you would, we're going to be in Matthew 13 again. But we saw this picture last week again as the family of Jesus, the family, spiritual family that he's building. We looked at this passage in 1 Peter right now, and we see even more of the picture of that. People called out of darkness into God's light. But we ask, why did he do that? Why did Jesus have to go through everything that he did for this to happen? I think we can get some of those answers in Matthew 13. So we're going to be Matthew 13, and we're going to start in verse 44. Again, parables this week. So only 44 through 52, Matthew 13, Jesus says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid, and for the joy over it, he goes and he sells everything that he has, and he buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who when he has found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had to buy it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore. They sat down, they gathered the good into vessels, but threw the bad away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Jesus said to them, 'Have you understood all these things?' They said to him, 'Yes, Lord.' Then he said to them, 'Therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old.'" So, 3 parables in front of us. Like, we talked about Jesus switched into this teaching method of teaching in parables, really because of all of these guys that were around causing problems and all of those things. We've kind of dealt with why he did that. The parables were there so that, people that understand God's purposes and understand God, they see the truth of God in the parables. But the people that could care less and the people that were there to cause problems, they're just hearing a story. They're just hearing a story about, fishermen. They're just hearing a story about a merchant. They're just hearing a story about a guy walking through a field. But Jesus is like, my people are going to understand the bigger picture here. So 3 parables. We have the parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of the pearl of great price, and the parable of the dragnet. Let's see what we can learn from these. The first 2 parables here, they're really pretty similar. They're pretty similar in purpose. And ultimately, they really make generally the same point. And they're short, but it's a really incredible point. So we're going to work our way to that point. And I think that getting to that point in this parable will help us understand the question from a minute ago. Why did Jesus do all that he did? The point of these parables, I think, really brings that into focus. So when we think about this, when we stop to think about why did Jesus go through everything that he went through, we have to think about what he went through was crazy. It really was. There was a moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's in Luke 22. It's in Matthew 26. There was a moment before Jesus was arrested where he was talking to his Father. He was talking to God the Father, and he's like, if there is any other way for this to happen, then take the cup from me. Take the responsibility away from me to have to go through all of these things. We have to remember that Jesus was both fully God and he was also fully man. As God, Jesus knew the pain, the suffering. He knew he was going to experience the abandonment of friends. He knew the treatment that he was going to go through, the shame that he was going to endure. He knew that he was going to die. He knew everything that he was going to have to go through. As God, he absolutely knew those things. But he also sat there as man, and he had to deal with the understanding of what that was going to feel like, what it was going to be to have to go through that. He was going to have to go through that like us. He was going to have to feel that like we would. Just because he's God doesn't mean he alleviated the pain, that he alleviated the emotional like feeling of the stuff happening to him. He didn't eliminate those things. He went through those things in our shoes. He knew those things. So Jesus did request, take this cup or this responsibility away from me. Because like no person, as he sat there as a man, no person would ever desire to go through those things. But then he followed that up immediately. He said, but not my will be done. Your will be done, Father. And what we see in that is that there was a greater desire in Jesus for his Father's will to be accomplished than there was to avoid the pain and the suffering. His desire was greater on one side than even the desire to avoid the hard parts. And I think we see why in this parable. Let's look at the first one for a moment. First one in verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid, and for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has to buy that field. We find here a man who's apparently wandering through a field. In the field, he happens across the treasure. I don't know how well hidden the treasure was to just find it in the field. I mean, he found it in the field. My kids and I, and the whole family, we've been watching National Treasure. It would lead me to believe that it's a lot harder to find a treasure. I mean, it's like ridiculous steps. And the whole point is like, there's always going to be another clue. But it seems difficult. He was wandering through a field and he found a treasure. But this guy, as luck would have it, he walks through this field. He finds the treasure. He then makes sure that the treasure is hidden again. And he leaves and he goes and he sells everything that he has to buy the field that the treasure is in. He does this for the parable's sake, because usually the parable was rooted in the real world practices. And under the law, you couldn't just take the treasure out of the field because that treasure was the property of the owner of that field. So obviously the next step was like, well, I got to buy this field because that treasure is worth me buying this field. So what we see here is apparently this treasure was so valuable to the man. This is just one verse. We see that the treasure was so valuable to this man that he was willing to sell everything that he had so that he could own this field and then own this treasure. And maybe this leads us to some general questions like, well, who is this guy? Does he even have anything to begin with to sell that's worth, maybe he didn't have to sell that much to buy the field. What would I have to find in a field to be worth me liquidating every possession I have to buy it? Like, what would I have to find that would be worth enough for me to liquidate everything to get? It probably leads to all sorts of questions. But I think the first and most important question that we have to ask is, who is this guy? Who is this guy wandering through the field? I think sometimes people can look at this parable and they can come to the conclusion that, well, maybe the person walking through the field, maybe it must be, maybe it must be us. Like maybe we're the ones walking through the field. Maybe we have come to see how great Jesus is. Maybe we've stumbled across Jesus in the field of life. Maybe all of this has sunk in enough for us to know that he is worth everything that I have. And while that is absolutely true, it's a wonderful sentiment, it's not the picture here. Like, that's not what's going on here. The man in the parable, the man's not us. And the fact that it's not us makes this way more impactful. Because, I think we can get there. The man in this parable is in fact Jesus. He's the one that he's relating this parable, and the parable is him walking through this field. And if the man is Jesus, then what is the treasure that Jesus is finding? What could Jesus possibly find that would be so valuable? Like, what in the world would be worth God the Son giving up everything for so that he could get this treasure? Like I said, I mean, this is literally God. He is God the Son. He lives in heaven. He made all things. He is worshiped constantly as he is in heaven. He's glorious. He's awesome. Like, I don't think we can even wrap our minds around all that he is and all that he has. And he's like, I will give it all up. All of it. I'll give it all up for this treasure. And I hope that, I hope the picture is coming into view, and maybe you've realized what the treasure is, but please understand if you don't. As Jesus is walking through this field and Jesus finds this treasure, the treasure is us. Like, the treasure is us. The treasure is the people that would be saved by Jesus. See, last week we talked about that family of Jesus. Jesus wanted to build the family. He wanted to save people. He wanted to do the will of his Father. In his humanity, he asked his Father, is there any other way that this could happen? But he knew the answer to that. He did. He knew the answer. So why did Jesus go through everything that he had to go through? I think the answer in this parable is that he valued us enough. He valued us enough to give up everything, to go through everything that he did to purchase us with his blood. And that's an incredible truth. That God the Son sitting in heaven and all of that glory and everything that that entails, he saw people, saw us, and said, you're worth enough to me that I will give all of this up. I'll come down and bleed and die for you. And it's really the same truth in the next parable. Let me read this one too. Starting in verse 45, it says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had, and he bought it. Again, Jesus is the merchant. He's out looking for beautiful pearls. He finds one pearl that's incredible, but it has an incredible price. It has a great price. So once again, this pearl was worth him going and selling everything to get it. It's the same picture. And it's an incredible picture of how much Jesus values each and every one of his people. So like I mentioned a minute ago, think about what he gave up. It's crazy. Think about coming down out of heaven to come to earth. We're the opposites. Man, heaven's going to be awesome one day. Jesus stepped out of heaven to come down to earth. Came down to earth and all of its problems. Think about leaving a place where you were literally worshipped by angels to come down to earth and be mocked by men. It's crazy. Think about being in a place where there is no sickness, there is no pain, there's no death, to come down for the purpose of experiencing pain and death. To be actually God and yet willing to walk in our shoes to save us. Like I said, I don't think we can really understand what he gave up to come for us. But even just to get a glimpse, it's man, it's crazy. It's when we see these parables, when we see this talk of Jesus' value, of his treasure, of the pearl, what he's willing to purchase, what he wants to purchase, what he's willing to give up everything for. It's maybe we, as we sit here as an individual, maybe we've gone through life without much esteem. Maybe we didn't come from much. Maybe we see ourselves in some kind of negative way. Maybe life hasn't gone the way we expected or the way that we hoped for. Maybe we've been torn down by other people in all kinds of ways. Maybe we've messed up pretty bad. We all have. Maybe we just don't know what to think about ourselves and about our lives. But I tell you what, and I said, please listen and please understand that every single one of those things, all of those potentially negative thought processes that we have on our life, like every single one of those things definitively needs to take a back seat to the fact that Jesus valued us enough to step out of heaven and come save us. It's like, forget all your devaluing of yourself and all of those things. Like, Jesus saw the value, saw the price tag. He was like, I'll pay for that. It's worth it for me. Stepped out of heaven to come save us. He saw that one pearl. He saw that one person. He saw you. He saw me. He was like, that's beautiful. The price is crazy, but I got it. I'll give it all up and I'll buy it. And he bought us because he valued us that much. I read this. I read these parables. I think about this truth of Jesus' value of us. And, I think about myself, and I think some of you know maybe some of my story. But like when you think of personal perspective of yourself, like for me, some of my early story, like I was born to a 12-year-old girl, which is crazy. But I was not even just born of a 12-year-old girl. I was born of a 12-year-old girl she was kidnapped and she was raped and she was held hostage for weeks. The man that had her tried to have me aborted. There was an attempt to murder my mother and I while I was still in the womb that was intervened by the Border Patrol. Lots of other things. I was supposed to be put up for adoption. That didn't happen. When I was born, we were living in shelters and on the streets for the first couple years of my life. And my mother she helped sell drugs and stuff so that I could eat. I mean, that was the process to get here. Eventually, me and her, as she was still a teenager, we ended up in foster care together. That's where we heard about Jesus. The fact that there was a retired, single, older woman that is like, I'm just going to take people into my house and take them to church. She gave us a place to live and took us to church. Heard about Jesus. But there's been a temptation, I think, in my life, a thought process in my life at times to be like, man, look where I came from. Like obviously nobody actually wanted me here. Like I was born of a rapist. Like what sort of lineage or what sort of origin story is that? And that's why the truth of a passage like this, I think it means so much. Like, I wasn't anybody. Like, still don't think I'm anybody special. But Jesus completely and radically changes the perspective. Like, there's no criteria on earth. Like, there's no pedigree that you could come from. Like, there's no family lineage. There's no high personal self-esteem. There's no accomplishment or education or status. Like, there's literally nothing that matters compared to the fact that Jesus said, you're worth enough for me to step out of heaven to come save you. There's nothing that matters compared to the fact that Jesus saw enough value in me to come save me. Nothing else matters. Forget all the other stuff. But don't let that make us prideful. Jesus didn't come because I'm so great. She's like, oh, you're so great. I'll come save you because you're great. That's not how this works. It wasn't because of it wasn't because we were special. It wasn't because we were great. It's because the greatness of his love. The greatness of his love was like, I love enough that I value you and my love to come save you. But I would hope that seeing this truth would change our perspective. It would cause us to get out of our own head. Forget all the other stuff. Stop worrying about everybody else's opinion. Stop worrying about what your own flesh is telling you about your own self. Stop worrying about all these things. The only opinion that should really matter and hold any weight in our life is Jesus' opinion. These parables contain a wonderful picture. And it's shared through, the story, the picture of these parables. But then, as Jesus often does, he gives this beautiful truth in these parables. And then he takes a really hard turn into a reality check. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful truth. I mean, it's incredible. Like I said, really hard turn straight into a reality check. We see that starting in verse 47. Verse 47, Jesus says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore, and they sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but threw the bad away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into a furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth." Yeah, it's a reality check if you ever see one. It's the same thing that we talked about in the parable of the wheat and the tares. Like we just went through that a couple weeks ago. In that one, we saw that at harvest time, the harvest came, the good wheat was gathered into the barn, and the tares were like the corrupted plants were gathered together and they were burned in the fire. So just like that one, they were gathered into the barn, and this one, like the good catch is gathered into vessels and the bad catch goes to the fire. Jesus is so clear time and time again, even when he's speaking in parables. Like he's clear that his people, like he's teaching his people. Like he's talking this way so that his people will understand. But he's so clear that his people will be gathered safely at the end of the age. Like they'll be gathered safely. They'll be gathered to the barn. They'll be gathered to the vessels. But he's so clear that those that aren't his people won't be. He's talked about like the tares, like the corruption, like those that are corrupted or those that are wicked. But really it just comes down to the fact that those that ignore or deny him. He says that those people that never turn to Jesus will end up in the fire. Like it's like one of those things, don't say he didn't warn you. Like the warning is there. Incredible truth, but it comes with a warning. And sometimes the warning is like the most loving thing. It's just like, I love you, don't go down that path. Like there's bad things at the end of that path. But I'm telling you that there's a different path. Like it is still love that would cause him to bring this reality check at this moment to say, my people will be safe and they will come with me. But those that aren't, won't. It's a reality check. It's loving. It's the truth. It's the going back to the parable of the wheat and the tares. It's like, if you got ears, hear. That's what he said. If you have ears, please hear what I'm saying, because it's really important. And he's saying, I love people enough to do all that I did to save them. And I love you enough right now to warn you that if you don't come with me, that it's not going to end well. We know from Scripture, obviously, that Jesus is clearly talking about hell. A lot of times we don't like to talk about hell, but it's the reality. It's like, be with him forever or not. He says, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. I came to save you. I died. I was buried. I rose again. Your sins were nailed to that cross with me. Believe it. Turn from yourself, turn from evil, turn to me. Like he says, it's free. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to do anything. Jesus looks at his disciples. Like I said, in the parable of the wheat and the tares, he's telling everybody, he's like, if you have ears, hear. And then he turns to his disciples in this passage, and in verse 51, he's like, have you guys understood these things? Like I've been talking. Are you understanding it? His disciples looked back at him and they responded and they said, yes, Lord, like we understand what you're saying. I think the same question can be asked of us this morning, like, have we understood these things? Like Jesus wants us to know how he feels. Jesus wants us to understand his perspective of things. Jesus wants us to know the seriousness of the situation, just like he wanted his disciples to know. So he gave up everything to come for us. He doesn't want us to be stuck in confusion about it. Like, he wants us to know exactly what it means. Like we heard last week, we're the church, we're his family. We're all at different places in our life and in our walk with Jesus. And I believe that even in our small church here, I believe that there is enough love in this place that, if we're struggling in any of these areas, or maybe we simply don't understand him. Jesus is looking at his closest friends, like the guys that have been following him. He's like, do you guys understand? Like, I need to make sure that you understand. I believe that there's enough love in this place that if we don't understand, we can talk about it. Like, there's no judgment here. We don't understand something yet. There is growth forward to say, like, I don't understand something. Let's talk about it. Let's grow. Let's understand who Jesus is and what he does. Let's understand what his word says. And then together, we can encourage each other forward. Like I said, I believe that we can have love and not judgment here for growth. My hope is that this place is so rooted in an incredible love for God that it would cause us to love each other with his love. But as we grow in that, and as we love that way, I believe also that love has to grow even beyond these walls and cause us to love and to spread the truth of Jesus Christ to other people, as with the passage we read in Peter at the beginning, that need to be moved out of darkness and into God's marvelous light. Like, we've seen the light. We need other people to see it too. That's what verse 52 is all about here. Verse 52, Jesus says, then he said to him, therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old. Really, the idea of this verse, if to make it a little more simple, Jesus is basically saying that those that are now instructed in the truth of the kingdom, those of his people that now understand his truth of his kingdom, of who he is, they now bear the responsibility to spread the wealth or the treasure of his kingdom to others. That's what he's saying. Like our mission statement, we're supposed to be broadcasting Jesus. That's why it's in our mission statement. If we understand the wealth and the value of his truth, the instruction there is that everyone that understands this needs to bring out of this treasure and spread the new that you learned and the old that you have, spread it. All of this, all of the truth of this passage this morning, it makes me think of, and I know I mentioned this verse a couple of weeks ago, but I want to go to Hebrews 12 together, and we'll kind of just end here. I think it really wraps this all up together. Hebrews 12. I'll give you a moment to get there. So Hebrews 12, and we're just going to be looking at verses 1 and 2 of Hebrews 12. So, starting in verse 1, Hebrews 12, it says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. In these verses, it starts with this picture. So it says a cloud of witnesses. And it really has the idea of all of Jesus's people that have gone before us. There has been generations and hundreds and thousands of years of people that know Jesus that have gone before us. And the picture here really is almost like, God's people, in the stands or bleachers of heaven, looking on at the race that's happening. There's this picture of, this cloud is all of these millions of people that have come to know Jesus before us. And they're sitting in the stands and they're watching the race of this current generation of God's people still running the race forward. The writer of Hebrews is I mean, basically, he's like, you've been wearing this sin like a weighted vest. Like, you got this vest full of weight and sin on. He's like, it's time to take off the weight. It's time to take off the vest. It's time to lay aside the sin so that we can actually get into the race. He says, and while you're running and while you're racing, he says, keep your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And then it says, and this is so important, it's like what ties back into our passage this morning. It says that for the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross. He despised the shame and has now sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So Jesus understood all of the pain and the suffering that was coming on the cross, but there was a specific joy that was in front of him that compelled him to move forward towards the cross, towards the shame and everything that entailed. That joy was the treasure in the field. That joy was the pearl of great price. That joy was the people that Jesus was going to save. So for the joy set before him, he stepped forward to endure these things. He gave up everything to get the treasure. It's the only reason why we sit here today talking about it. It's the only reason why we actually have an opportunity to have a fixed relationship with God Almighty. It's the only reason. It's the only reason that when the harvest comes or when the nets are dragged in, it's the only reason why you might be gathered into the barn or gathered into the vessels is because of what he did. He's the only reason why we can avoid being tossed into the fire that we deserve. He's the only reason. I'm glad that he valued us enough to do that for us. I'm glad that he valued us enough to do that for us, so please don't let yourself or let anybody else devalue you, because he values us that much. We don't have to go to this one, but just as a verse to consider. This is probably why I had 1 Peter 1. There's another passage in 1 Peter 1. But in 1 Peter 1, it says, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things. Like you weren't saved by silver or by gold. It says you weren't saved by the aimless conduct of the tradition of your fathers. So it says like you were not saved with money. You were not saved because of your parents that walked before you. It says instead, you were saved with the precious blood of Christ. For us, there's no room for pride. But let us find our worth. Let us find our purpose. Let us find, hopefully, everything in him and him alone. Let's pray.